Welcome. This is definitely a bigger turnout than I was expecting, but I'm really excited to be here and speak about this topic of the lives of the saints. As you can see, I prepared some readers for us. Since there are a little bit more than expected, we might have to share amongst families, if that's okay. I'm happy to print out some more for next week, but I think I have almost 30 copies or so. As I was going through and kind of preparing my notes and thinking up some of the readings that we were going to do over this, short little class, I was incredibly disappointed with how many saints we weren't going to have the opportunity to speak about, because I kept thinking about all of these different, lives of saints and different types of lives of saints that I really wanted to look at. And I kept saying, oh, we should read this one. Oh, we should read this one. Oh, we should read this one. And then I kept bumping up against the reality that after this week, we really have only 4 weeks prepared. Honestly, as I started to think about this, I thought, maybe this could be like a monthly thing, where we read a saint every month and come together once a month to speak about the specific life of a saint. So we'll see how this grows and perpetuates itself in this class. I kind of came up with a list of themes, if you saw in the class handout, and tried to stick to those themes a little bit. It turns out that what we're going to see is that the themes and the readings themselves are really going to be similar across all of the lives of the saints, right? The lives of the saints are really the stories of men and women who are devoted in their life to God. So all the stories are going to manifest themselves, accordingly. And so in the works that I picked something associated with the ascetic saints. And with the ascetic saints, I'm more going to concentrate on the early ascetic saints, so especially like the desert saints. I always find them fascinating, and they have the most incredible stories that I love reading. They're more like fairy tales in a lot of ways when you read the lives of the ascetic saints. And then from that, we're going to read the lives of Saints Peter and Fevronia, who are a married couple in 12th century Russia. So we're going to read one of their lives. And then the martyrs. So a heavy emphasis on the martyrs is oftentimes, again, the pre-Constantine period before the 3rd and 4th century, because this is when the martyrs really were developed, let's say, in the life of the church. And then also, the martyrs have always existed. So we're gonna look at some early martyrs, Saints Perpetua and Felicitas, who are early Roman martyrs. And then lastly, I wanted to look at some modern saints, because the lives of the saints aren't this 2,000-year-old reality, but a continuing of in the life of the church. And so one of my favorite modern saints is Saint Porphyrios, who died in 1991 on Mount Athos. And so I started looking at putting his life together. And then I was talking to my former teacher, Dr. Tim Patizis. I was like, who would you pick? And he said, you have to pick Saint Gabriel of Georgia. And so Saint Gabriel of Georgia passed away in 1995. And he's beloved in Georgia. He very much, fought against the communists, and so we're gonna be looking at his life as well. In terms of these lives that I had printed out, the last life of Saint Anthony, I actually gave you the full version, and we've got 2 weeks to read it. So it's about 70 pages in just kind of a normal book, but we've got 2 weeks to read it, so I hope that's plenty of time. And we'll talk a little bit about the details of it when we speak about the life of St. Anthony. But it's really the first, let's say, hagiography that was written. And it was written by a contemporary of his, St. Athanasios of Alexandria, who my new son is named after. And so this style of writing that we'll see in the life of St. Anthony, you'll see that it follows the very mundane aspects of his life to the very extraordinary aspects of his life. And again, it was written by a contemporary, so this isn't something that was written some 100 years or hundreds of years later, which is common with many of the saints. And the other readings are much shorter than that, and they are taken from various writers who were specifically dedicated to those saints. Actually, Peter and Fevronia was written some 400 years later, so in the 1600s, speaking about this married couple from the 1200s. And then lastly, of course, St. Porphyrios. There are people who knew St. Porphyrios. And in fact, just last week, I was in Dallas at a church consecration, and I met a monk there who was a monk on Mount Athos for many years, and he told me how he had met St. Paisios and spent time with St. Paisios, the Athonite, who just died in 1992, and then also St. Ephrem of Katonakia. And both of these were just recently canonized a couple of years ago. And I had to ask the question, what's it like to meet a saint? And he's like, beyond anything that you can explain. So, the saints in our lives, they are, these people that have this ability to transform us. And in reading their lives, we see their dedication to God. And it's really this dedication to God that we look to. One of my professors in school, he always said that the lives of the saints are something to be honored and recognized, but not necessarily to be emulated. So what we'll find in a lot of the lives of the saints is there's some quite extreme things that happen in their lives. Very, very extreme. So extreme that we would have, difficulty understanding like how this is a path to holiness. And I'll give you a small example of this. Saint Theodore of Sicyon. He was a saint in the 6th century or so a Byzantine saint. And he trapped himself in an iron cage and dangled it over a cliff. And he lived in this cage for years. And people brought him food, but he had nothing else. And during this time, it said that the weather was so cold that his feet, which were bare, would freeze to the iron grate. And if he lifted his feet, it would rip the skin off. And so we read this and we think, okay, I'm not going to be locking myself in an iron grate and like this being the path to holiness, right? And it seems very extreme and so far out, like craziness, right? I mean, it seems absolutely crazy if you saw somebody doing that. And yet when we read these stories, we have to realize that there's somehow a place for this in the church. And when we speak about, the narrow gate and the narrow pathway to salvation, that doesn't mean uniformity. And the saints give us this idea that there is no uniformity in terms of action or who we should be or exactly what we should do, but there's an innumerable number of ways that we can move towards holiness and sanctity. And for each person, that's going to be completely different. And in fact, St. Theodore of Sicyon in this life says basically that. He's like, this is not for everyone, obviously. And, this path was laid before me, but this path is not for everyone. So when you read these lives, I want you to make sure you take that into account. And there's many accounts over history of relaying, let's say, people emulating the saints incorrectly. It's really interesting that St. Gregory the theologian writes this famous oration about his good friend, St. Basil the Great. So these two great pillars of the church were very, very good friends with each other. And so when St. Basil dies, St. Gregory the theologian writes this great funeral oration. And it's a real funeral oration. Like, it takes 4 hours to read. So if you went to this funeral, it would have been spectacular. But in this oration, he kind of berates people and says, if you simply copy his way of life. And what he was doing was he was saying people were actually dressing like him and walking around town like him and talking like him and emulating, let's say, these outward manifestations of his life. If you do this, you do a disservice to the saint. Instead, you should be emulating his devotion to God rather than, these specific manifestations of how St. Basil does it. And so I think as we start reading through the lives of the saints and as you start broadening, let's say you're broadening the breadth of the saints that you do read, you're going to find this, that they're all completely unique from each other. So that's I think, a big thing that I'd like everyone to take away from the class. and just in your own experience of how to read these lives. Any questions so far? Please interrupt me along the way. I know there's a lot of us, but I like conversation just than bloviation. So, yeah.
How many saints are there?
Innumerable. So one thing, I point out is there are the saints that, let's say, are officially recognized by the church. And when we say the church, that's a little bit of a tricky thing, right? Because there's local churches, right? And then there's, let's say, metropolises and archdioceses and patriarchates and these large churches all over the world. Now, what I would say is there's probably something we could distinguish as like local saints and then universal saints. So anywhere you go in the world, everyone will celebrate St. George, St. Nicholas, St. Demetrius, St. Basil the Great, great theologian, John Chrysostom, all these great saints that we hear about in whenever we list saints, like at the end of the services or whatever. So those, I wish I had a count for you for those. Like let's say these universal saints. And then below that, there's going to be local saints. So, only certain churches will celebrate them. Whether it's a Greek tradition or in a Russian tradition, Serbian, Bulgarian, a lot of English saints, right? And now we're starting to cultivate our own American saints that are starting to be recognized. And if you were here when Bishop Athanasios was visiting our parish, he was a holy man. And if you met him, you were like, he was a saint. So will he ever be canonized officially by a church? Maybe, maybe not, but I pray to him. And I know a lot of people also ask for his prayers. So in terms of, the official canonized saint, there's innumerable. And then beyond that, countless more. And one way that I'm going to emphasize that a little bit in some of the stories that we're going to read is, I might as well share one. St. Anthony the Great, whose story we're going to read, probably the greatest ascetic saint that we know of, at least that's written. And there's a little story here, let me just read. He thinks to himself, I wonder with whose spiritual achievements my spiritual life can be compared with. So he wants to know who else is as great as him. God, however, in order to humble this thought, revealed to him in a dream that superior to him was a shoemaker who had a store in the back streets of Alexandria. Once it was daybreak, the saint took his staff and headed off to the city. He wanted to meet in person this famed shoemaker and see his virtues. With great difficulty, he discovered his store, sat down at the counter, and began asking about his life. The man was simple and didn't even occur to him who this elderly monk was that had come so unexpectedly into his shop asking for him. The man, while continuing to work and without taking his eyes off the shoes he was working on, replied gently, Elder, I don't know if I have ever done anything good. Every morning after waking up, I pray and then I start to work. First, I think to myself how every person in the city, from the smallest to the greatest, will be saved, and only I will be condemned due to my countless transgressions. And in the evening, when I go to sleep, I have the same thoughts. The elder rose with wonder and embraced and kissed him and said emotively, You, my brother, like a good merchant, have gained the priceless pearl without toil. I have grown old in the desert, sweated and toiled, but have not reached your level of humility. So these, classifications that we have for sainthood, you go and live in the desert for 40 years, right? You go live in a monastery. These are good things. I mean, we would never, we're going to highlight this quite a bit. But we read countless stories like this actually in the lives of the saints, especially in the Desert Fathers, because they're always highlighting the place of certain virtues in life. And specifically, I brought this little book, The Lives of the Desert Fathers, that they always highlight the place of humility and how a humble person can be anywhere. And so in this, we see a shoemaker, right? Living in the middle of the city, perhaps married, it doesn't say, but living in the middle of the city, doing his normal job, and he has outstripped the virtue of St. Anthony, who lived in the desert for 40 years, dedicated wholly himself to God. So in a lot of ways, these kinds of stories can give us good hope. Because one of the difficulties with the lives of the saints is they seem so extraordinary and so out of reach that I can't possibly do these things. So what chance is there for me? And we'll see time and again that, most of us won't be called to martyrdom. Probably none of us will be, right? Not in the way that they were in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries. But we're going to be called to our own martyrdom, right? The martyrdom of being in a family, the martyrdom of being obedient to someone else. And then, are we called to asceticism? Well, we're not going to live in the desert and eat 2 ounces of bread once a week. That's certainly not it. But we also live in a world in which we're inundated with, input. And our asceticism is really just to reject a lot of that input. Right? Let's face it, St. Anthony didn't have to deal with, the internet. Twitter, right? He didn't have a Twitter feed. It would have been the same every day, like, here's the desert. So lots of sand, yeah. So, the saints didn't have to deal with the same things that we did, and so we're going to be called to a different type of asceticism. So that's why I want to really highlight again that idea of emulation. We're not called to emulate in terms of their action, but rather in their devotion to God. So how can we learn from these lives and, let's say, translate that into our modern life? Right? How can we emulate, or how can we be devoted to God in the same way as these saints were? And so in this, I want to kind of talk about, what this definition is of, who were the saints, who are the saints. Of course, we have scriptural references to this, that, from Psalm 67, God is wondrous in his saints. And then St. Paul says many times in his epistles to all those that be in Rome, to all those that are in Corinth, that are called to be saints. So when we think of this word saints, the translation from Greek is agios, which means the holy ones. Okay? And the holy ones are those that are just devoted to God. So that's what a saint is. Someone who has devoted themselves to God. And, that really highlights what St. Anthony had experienced when he met the shoemaker. He met somebody who lived in a city whose whole life living in the city was dedicated to God. So really the answer is the saints are everywhere, right? And we're all called to be saints. And we also, let's say, designate a little bit capital saints from the lowercase saints. St. Paul is really speaking about, let's say, lowercase saints, those dedicated themselves to God. And when we speak about the lives of the saints in the church, we're talking about the capitalized saints. Those are like the all-star players that everybody knows. Okay? And so the church has put these particular saints, I'm not going to say above the rest, because we don't have that ability, but merely to say these people have lived a life devoted to God. And so we're going to just point them out and say they have devoted themselves to God. And so that's how we would separate these, lowercase saints from these capital saints, if that makes sense. And so just a little bit of some history and then thematic elements about the writings themselves. The lives of the saints has been around since the beginning. It's not a newer invention. The earliest saints that were spoken about were, of course, the apostles. There were many writings that were written about the apostles. We know, of course, in the New Testament texts, if you really think about the New Testament, especially when we look at Acts, Acts is really the life of the saints, right? It's a canonical life of the Acts of the apostles. And that's what it is. It's looking at the miracles that the apostles did after Christ had ascended into heaven. So a lot of the lives that followed afterwards kind of followed in this same style. And in fact, also in the first century, there were other Acts that were written. There were the Acts of Peter, there were Acts of Andrew, there were Acts of Paul and Thecla that we'll speak about a little bit. And these other Acts, while they never became canonical, have still existed within the life of the church as these writings of importance. If you haven't picked up on this in the church, we don't really say too many things dogmatically, right? We have some dogma that's basically established in the creed, and beyond that, we're like, there's some really good things, and then there's some less important things. And we even pick up on these kinds of things like in the liturgy. What's the most important book that we read in the liturgy? The Bible? Really specific? The Gospels. Do we read the whole Gospel? No. We only read certain parts of the Gospels because the church has said these readings are more important than the other ones. That's okay. Doesn't mean that the other ones aren't important too, but the church has elevated certain readings of the Gospels and said these are important. And they're so important that we're going to put them in the liturgy. And then what's the second most important? The epistles. Now, epistles proceed immediately from before the gospel. You'll also recognize that who reads the gospels? Priests or the deacons, the clergy. And who reads the epistles? The people. Okay? So again, recognizing that the epistles are not as important as the gospels. Now, there's a very specific epistle that a part of the New Testament that's never read. What is that? Revelations. So the church is like, okay, it's canonical, but we're not going to read it in church. It doesn't say don't read it, but we're not going to read it in church. Okay? So the texts that have been, made it into the canonical text of the Bible are those that have been set apart as being important and God-inspired and good. But even within those texts, there's an ordering, and the church has determined what this ordering is within the liturgical service. Okay? So remember, the liturgy is the central part of the church. And the liturgy brings out the worship, it brings out our dogma, it brings out even the lives of the saints. Because every day in the church we celebrate and sing hymns to the lives of the saints, right? Father Evan will come out and say, today we're singing about this saint. Some saints are sung about and some are never sung about. That's not to say that some are more important and less important, but more just so how the church elevates certain people above others in terms of, let's say, role models. That makes sense. Yeah.
So what's the process of the canonization of a saint?
Great question.
Like if a local church can do it, or
Yep.
How is that?
Yep. Local churches can, let's say, canonize a saint, and there is no process for that other than people just recognize that this person was a saint. So, like Bishop Athanasios, many, many people here and around the world who knew him were like, he was a saint. And so we have that's it. Like, for me, it's done. He's a saint. And I think other people here probably had the same experience, having known him. And I've met other people, and I was like, wow, that person is a saint. Now, there's a greater, let's say, canonization process if this person wants to be recognized in a church-wide level. So, for example, I mentioned St. Porphyrios, who died in 91. And for this process, usually there's a local community, and he was very renowned. He was a priest on Mount Athos, and then he was in Athens for many, many years, and then he returned to Athos, and everybody who knew him was like, he's a saint. And so, this, I hate to use the word cult because it has such a negative connotation, but this community builds up around this individual, recognizing their sainthood. And it starts to elevate and, expand. And whether miracles are done by this person or not, it doesn't matter. We don't have a fixed process like the Catholic Church does. And so what will happen is then at some point they'll appeal probably to their local hierarch and then to a patriarch. And the patriarch will basically, send somebody and say, well, check him out. And then from there, a patriarch might canonize the person as a saint. But we don't have a timeline. They have to do, 3 miracles and something that the Catholic Church has? And then it has to have been a certain number of years. And first they're blessed, and then they're something, and then they're made a saint. We don't have anything like that. And there's no time period whatsoever. In fact, Gregory Palamas... Hello.
Sorry, and thank you for Nicholas's faithful guiding of the class.
Oh, super fun.
And for all of you attending, pretty wonderful, right? So I may be blessed.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you.
St. Gregory Palamas died in the 14th century, 1353, and he was canonized 1354. Because everybody just recognized that he was a saint. So he was made a saint right away. Some may take 10 years, some 100 years, some 1,000 years. So there is a loose canonization process. If you ever think that, the Orthodox Church is organized or we've got a structure, a way of doing something, we don't. So, which is great. I love it. Yeah.
So, out of curiosity, I'm new to the Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
Why isn't the book of Revelations ever read in church?
Mostly because it can lead to confusion. If you read the text, how do we interpret it? So the church has put it in there recognizing that this is a revelation of St. John about the end times, but there's never been a strong commentary on it. No saints have written really about Revelations. And so it's just left it on the side and said, this is good to read, but don't use it to make any interpretations. Don't try to seek out time periods or anything like that. Jeremy?
I was going to say, Andrew of Caesarea, his commentary on Revelation is widely considered to be pretty good.
Okay. When was he?
4th century.
Okay. It's pretty sparse in general, though, and Revelations was added to the canon after that. I believe it was the 6th century. So if he wrote on it, it wasn't added into the biblical canon until after that. That's honestly another reason why it was never in the services, because it wasn't part of the canon when the services were being written. So that's another big part. Yeah.
So you said 6th century.
I'm pretty sure it was much, much later. I want to say it's 5th or 6th century when it was finally added to the Bible.
Did he say that the locusts are helicopters?
That's why.
Yeah.
I was just going to comment early on when we were attending how the list of saints is read at the end of the service.
Mm-hmm.
I was shocked to hear someone probably say King Richard of Essex.
Oh, yeah.
I'm like, what? It didn't sound like an Orthodox guy to me. I don't know, but that surprised me. That was an example of a homegrown, locally recognized
Right.
person.
Yeah. And one great thing about, being in the church in the U.S. is that we have such a diversity in terms of backgrounds. Because, so many have an Anglo-Saxon background, and so there's a strong affinity for the English, Scottish, Irish saints. And so people, in their desire to, be authentic in that way, have started devotions to these saints that in a lot of ways were lost in the East. Right after the Great Schism in the 11th century, there was a breakdown in communication between the West and the East, and not purposefully, but the East simply lost contact with the saints in the West, right, and lost their names. And so only recently have people started to rediscover these beautiful saints, especially everywhere in the British Isles, and started to bring them to mind a lot more. And so it's really beautiful, and I think that's a great gift that a lot of Orthodox in this country are starting to offer back to the Universal Church. Because until recently, I don't think anybody in the Orthodox Church was really recognizing them. I don't know too much about the history there, but yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if we missed this at the very beginning or if it's something you're going to get into, but the Revelation discussion reminded me. So one of the basic questions everyone asked me, I grew up in the church, but I'm new to the Orthodox Church, and it's about prayers to the saints, and veneration of the saints.
Right.
So one of the defenses or the arguments for praying to the saints is a lot of people reference Revelation, where the prayers of the saints go up before God like incense.
Sure.
So where else in the Gospels or the epistles, are you going to get into that at all?
I'm not going to talk too much about, let's say, how
do we know they hear us, essentially?
Right. Part of that is, it's part of the tradition of the church. I'll say that. And we can piece together a few small little things. One, we know that God is the God of the living and not of the dead. So when
we see Moses and Elijah with Jesus on...
Well, they're definitely still alive. Yeah. But even after death, we don't say people are sleeping. We say that people are somehow still alive with God, and they're not just in some sleepy state. And if that's the case, then there's some, and we don't know how this works. This is the teaching of the church, that these people are alive in God, and so they still participate in, the divine. And in that way, they also participate in the human reality, let's say. And they haven't just left and then forgotten about this fallen earth, right? Participating in the divine, they still recognize and want to, pray for the life of the world. And so that's a big part of it. And then also, from St. James, the prayers of a righteous man avail much. So we recognize the saints as being righteous, being alive in God. And so we pray to the saints just like we pray to each other, right? We'll ask each other for prayers, rather, right? I'm sick, I say, please pray for me. That's exactly what we do for the saints. There's no worship. Veneration simply means pray for us. Always in that context, never in some kind of worship context or, you're greater than, God in any way. And, there's often, leveraged against Mary, but because we say so much in the church, but how does every hymn to Mary end? Pray for us, or somehow reference to God. So just the one commemoration that we say, that I say a lot, commemorating our all holy Lady Theotokos and Ever Virgin Mary with all the saints, let us commit ourselves and one another and our whole life to Christ our God. Every single hymn that you read that's about Mary is going to redirect to God. Every single one. So it's never just like all Mary. It's never just like all the saints. There are these hymns that, there's so much that we can delve into. There are these hymns that are in Orthros. They're called the canon. And the canon is these set of hymns that's usually dedicated to a saint. Okay, the saint of the day specifically. And if you read these hymns, every single hymn will speak about something in their life, and then it'll say, and your devotion to Christ our God. And the way that you pointed other people to Christ our God. And the way that something Christ our God. So the lives of the saints, like I said, they're not, it's not the specific lives and the things that they've done that matter. It's their devotion to God that matters. And in reading their lives, and then the same thing with Mary, looking at Mary, we seek to emulate their devotion to God. And that's what becomes most important in our lives. And that's why we exalt and bring to mind all of the saints. They're really just like, they're sports stars, right? But what I don't like about the sports star analogy necessarily is how many of you are going to be, Nikola Jokic? For the Nuggets, sorry. Fellow Serbian, I had to bring him up. Or Djokovic. I mean, two of the best players in the world are both Serbians. Just saying. So I don't like the reference because how many of us are going to be, sports stars? How many of us could become sports stars? Maybe he's got a chance. The rest of us, sorry. So, but the sainthood and sanctity and the way that the saints lived is achievable for all of us at any point. And that becomes very, very clear in a lot of these lives. And we see this many times, like the thief on the left, the thief on the right. Thief on the left, not so much. The thief on the right. His whole life, let's say, wasted in sin. And in the last moment, right, he finds salvation. Right? The same thing with all the lives of the saints. We shouldn't ever think of these lives as, progress. Oh, I didn't start when, exercising my spiritual muscles when I was 12, therefore I can never reach the level of whatever, St. Anthony. It's not what, if that's your takeaway from these lives, that's the wrong takeaway. The takeaway is that you can achieve these, levels of humility, of patience, of holiness at any point in your life. In any place in the world, living in the city, living in the monastery, wherever. So this sanctity is achievable everywhere. So you can kind of think about it as, these are the superstars, but also achievable, superstar status. And
Excuse me.
oh, no problem.
I gotta go do the
Oh, yeah.
baptism, but can I have one?
Oh yeah,
Just one's fine.
Oh no, that is one.
Oh, that is one.
I told you it's big. It's a big packet. I'm sorry. So yeah, that's definitely the other big takeaway is that all of this is achievable, and then we can all find holiness. Good. Yeah.
When does that baptism start? Because I gotta go help.
Oh, it is in 7 minutes.
I'll stick around for a couple more minutes.
We're recording too, no problem. So I want to go over some themes. I've done this before. I'm sorry if you've taken one of my classes and I'm like, I have 5 pages and I haven't gotten through half of one. Okay, so some themes that we're going to see and then you're going to see over and over again in the lives of the saints. Miracles. A lot of miracle stories, especially when you read the Desert Fathers. They speak a lot of miracles. How to cultivate holiness and virtue, the role of divine intervention, conversion stories, of course, asceticism, martyrdom is, again, very popular, especially in the early lives of the saints. And then also very recently, right, we look at the past 100 years in communism especially, there's a lot of martyrdom stories. Dealing with the passions. Okay, so this is a big theme. And then one thing that's typically not dealt with, which I always found pretty interesting, is the kingdom of heaven. So let's say dealing with these, kind of exalted ideas and what the kingdom of heaven is like. And this is because the church is pretty grounded. We're like, we leave the kingdom of heaven up to God. Our job here is to be working on our passions, to be going through this daily struggle and to continue devoting ourselves to God. And so rarely do you read anything about like what the kingdom of heaven is like. Instead, a lot of it is very grounded in that way. And then on one side in these stories, we read about the extraordinary, right? Like unbelievable things. I read a story just the other day about a man who was turned into a lizard. And his family took him to a holy monk, and the monk said, well, it's because of this sin, and you all need to pray for 7 days, and then he'll turn back into a person. And they did, and he turned back into a person. So these kind of extraordinary stories, and then also what I would call the mundane, the everyday, just living life in a city. And that's kind of like the shoemaker. Right? You can read the life of that cobbler living in Alexandria in a couple of sentences, and somehow what he did outdid, 40 years of St. Anthony living in the desert. Now, the extraordinary ones are kind of more fun, but I think, the mundane stories are almost more important, right? I mean, let's face it, most of our lives are fairly simple, right? Not extraordinary in terms of going out and fighting dragons and these crazy things. We live our lives in simplicity and, hopefully in our devotion to God. Yeah, that's nice. And it's a nice size packet. St. Pachomios, who was a early desert father, said, if you see a man pure and humble, that is a great vision. For what is greater than such a vision? To see the invisible God in a visible man. All right? So we look to these qualities and these virtues rather than kind of these extraordinary stories. Okay, so now some of the types of the stories, again, very broad strokes, not necessarily things we're going to be looking at. I already mentioned that the New Testament is really one of these earliest, types of lives of the saints, and especially the Acts of the Apostles. And so in the 1st and 2nd century, we have several writings that are, associated with the lives of the apostles and then also the life of Mary. And these are highlighted in a few works. One is called the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is probably the most famous 1st century non-canonical work. And in this text, it's pretty much the life of Mary. Okay, so from when she entered into the temple to giving birth to Christ. So it's kind of this early life of Mary. And also in the same period, 1st and 2nd century, we have a famous work called The Acts of Paul and Thecla. Thecla was a woman saint who became a disciple of Paul. And if you read this work, which is fairly short, it ties in very nicely with the Acts of the Apostles. Okay? Now, it's really interesting. I'll bring this up a little bit later, or I'll just say it right now. Thecla, there's no historical proof for her existence other than in this one story of the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And the Orthodox Church doesn't really have a problem with this, let's say, of historicity, of having something validated outside of the story of that individual. But the Catholic Church, for example, has tossed out Thecla. So Thecla is a famous saint in the Orthodox Church. There's monasteries named after her, churches. She's a very, very well-known saint. And in 1969, the Catholic Church actually said, there's no proof that she existed. We're going to remove her as a saint from the church. And they did this with several saints. They actually downgraded St. Nicholas. They said he's no longer a universal saint. And they downgraded St. George. No real good proof of his existence. So they downgraded St. George. So a lot of these saints have been removed from the lives of from the Catholic calendar because there's no historical proof of their existence. And in the Orthodox Church, we don't have this same idea of truth. Okay? A lot of times we want to rest and have, let's say, unification between spiritual truth in the church, historical truth, and then scientific truth, right? And so we want to unite all these things. And I can go out to the desert and give you proof that the Noah's flood happened, right? So I can give you scientific proof of this thing. I can give you historical proof by looking at all these texts that here's Jericho, whatever, and that's fine. We can do that. But our faith shouldn't rest on these things. And it's powerful when they line up, right? Like you find the city of Jericho, you can find evidence, scientific or historical, archaeological evidence. That's great. But our faith shouldn't rely merely on historical, archaeological, scientific truth. And that's a little bit hard as Americans, I feel like, or Westerners in general, because we're so rationally minded, right? I need proof that this happens in order to support my faith. The Orthodox Church doesn't think that way. We think in the opposite direction. We believe in the truth of the church. And it's its own story, and it is the story of salvation. And this is the truth that we rely on. And these other truths are good. Like, we wouldn't come along and say, we're going to disregard all these other things. But we're going to say, what's more important? The truth of the church or like this other historical or scientific truth, let's say. And it creates a little bit of a tension, but there's really no need for the tension. We kind of live in this tension and embrace this tension. And like me personally, I see this all the time when I teach. I'm a physics teacher. So I teach a 14 billion-year-old universe in my physics class. And I have a lot of students that come up and struggle with this because they're, good evangelicals and the universe is 6,000 years old. And I never throw out like contradictory terms of, you're wrong. But I merely just say, listen, we've got these observations and they're good, and you have your faith, which is good. They don't have to argue with each other. They don't have to disagree with each other. We can, I actually know this monk who is a former scientist, and when he writes dates, he'll write like 1990, why did I say that? 2023, or according to some, the year 7,000 since the creation of the earth. And he has no problems believing it in both ways. No problems at all. And I think we can live in that reality. And the same thing is going to be the case with the lives of the saints. Many of the lives of the saints are going to be, we have no proof that they existed. And in fact, there's often evidence to prove that they didn't exist. A couple of examples there. There's Saint Alypios, who's commemorated on, let me get the date, January 26th, I believe. January 26th. So Saint Alypios the Stylite. And on the same date, January 26th, is also Saint Stylianos. Saint Alypios the Stylite and Saint Stylianos. Well, guess what? It's very likely, historically speaking, that Saint Stylianos is a copy error. And yet, Saint Stylianos has an entire life that's associated with him, and people that are dedicated to him, churches that are dedicated to him. And yet, it seems if we just look historically, that Saint Stylianos is simply a copy error, because they're on the same exact date, their names are almost exactly the same, and before a certain period of time, Saint Stylianos did not appear in texts. So how do we deal with this? Well, the Catholic Church tossed him out. Said, copy error, not a real person, getting rid of him. But the life of Saint Stylianos is a beautiful story. So why don't we keep the story? Why don't we keep the memory of this saint alive? Yeah.
Comparable to Jesus teaching in parables, like he said, there was a man that did this and that didn't happen. He's telling the story to prove a point. Is that similar?
I would take it a step further. I would say Saint Stylianos was a real person.
Okay.
Yeah. And the church teaches him as being a real person. And even if historical texts go back and say, copy error, I don't care. The church raises this up as a real person. So if we want to speak about historical proof, then okay, maybe we'll say that. But the church elevates this person as being a real saint. And we're okay with that. So that's that tension that we live in a little bit.
The church holds the tradition in the community.
Mm-hmm.
Holds it in rationalist or Enlightenment thinking. Renaissance, in the community.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what makes it different. In, say, the Catholic tradition or the Orthodox.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah.
I think, we live in a God who kind of historicity, right? And so, and then the church itself, in some sense, transcends that linear experience of reality. So that means that whatever this copy error meant from a purely human standpoint, what it was maybe doing was actually manifesting someone's memory who had been lost.
Exactly.
Or maybe not even one person's memory, but the memory of people who had engaged in this kind of life.
Right.
When we ask for his intercessions, then we're asking for the intercessions of those people who have devoted themselves in that same way.
Yeah, and it really highlights that we look to the saints as ideals as devotions to God. And so if the person didn't historically exist, and when I say historically, I mean like scientifically historically, that we can point to them, that's okay. Because we look to that life as a life of devotion to God.
That's why I was kind of referring to it as similar to parables.
Yeah, the only thing I don't like about the parables is it seems like Christ was really just making up an example. Whereas this, we would say, this isn't just an example. This is a real person.
But there's something to learn from it.
Yeah.
In the similar ways.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. Another quick example of this is another one of my favorites, is Saint Dionysius, the Areopagite. He was converted by St. Paul on the Areopagus Hill when St. Paul preached to the Athenians. Okay, this is in the Acts, and Saint Dionysius actually wrote this very famous corpus, and it's all about, let's say, mystical theology. And it was signed Saint Dionysius the Areopagite. Well, scholarship in the past 100, 200 years has come by and read, his work, and he 100% uses language that's Neoplatonic. And Neoplatonic language wasn't developed until the 3rd century. Like some very, very specific language, right? It's a philosophy. And he used a very specific philosophical framework to develop his thought. And so now people are like, well, it wasn't really Saint, and then his language was apparently very similar to a school of thought in Syria. So historically speaking, probably a Syriac monk. But the church doesn't say that. The church isn't going to all of a sudden say, oh, it was a Syriac monk. It wasn't really the first century saint. The church still acknowledges that it's the first century saint. Because this person is writing in the spirit of Saint Dionysius. And so we honor that and we keep that in memory. Now, that doesn't mean that scholastically we can't talk about this as, this is this tension, right? We can't talk about this as being a 5th century writing. We can scholastically speak about it that way. But when we talk again about the life of the church and the truth of the church, we say Saint Dionysius, the 1st century saint. And it's, believe it or not, it's extremely freeing to, let's say, accept and to live in this type of tension. To accept both of these things at the same time. Because in a way, if you don't, you're going to spend the rest of your life finding something else that's going to contradict something that you believe. Right? I mean, there's no proof for any of these things. And as you go through life, you're always going to find something that contradicts what you believe. Right? And then what are you going to do? Flip from one truth to another truth? No, instead we live in the life of the church, and the church teaches us what this truth is, and that's what we believe. And again, you can study these other things and find them interesting, like I study physics and I love it. But in no way does it contradict or change my view of creation or God or anything like that. So, Andrea?
I was just going to say, it sort of frees us from having to judge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Judge what's right. And I don't know if this is the right context. I know we're not supposed to judge. I think that's more with each other. But in a way, you could expand it and say it kind of applies to this too. You don't have to make that choice.
Right. Yep.
No one's forcing us to say, you need to find out what the exact truth is, or you're in error, and then it's stressful.
Yeah.
It's easier to live in the tension of not having to do the research and make the decision and figure it all out, to just accept it. Oh.
Right. It was really interesting. Somebody a few years ago came up and said, okay, Saint Constantine. I was like, yeah. It's like, he was a pretty terrible person. I was like, he did some pretty terrible things. I mean, he killed lots of people. He killed his son and his wife. He killed his wife, maybe. And he's a saint. I was like, yeah. Why? The church says he's a saint. And he's been celebrated as a saint for 1,600 years. So we accept him as a saint. And that's kind of where we are. And I mean, we obviously don't emulate those things, but look at David. What did David do?
Yeah.
Do we recognize David as being a saint of the church? Yes. So, this is also kind of modern culture a little bit, right? You pick out these, killing your son and all these things are pretty bad, but we pick out these, really negative events in someone's life, and then we define their life by those events, right? That's kind of modern culture a little bit. Oh, look what this person said 30 years ago. And instead, we should trust in the church. And this isn't somebody who became a saint 50 years ago. I mean, again, 1700 years ago, and we're still celebrating St. Constantine as one of the great saints of the church. And so we keep that in mind, yeah.
So, going back to the whole physics teacher, like Earth being billions of years old.
Mm-hmm.
So, I recently, just kind of over the past week while working, been listening to the New Testament.
Uh-huh.
And I don't remember which book it was in, but I recall it being said that the coming of Christ is going to take a long time because one day to God is a really long time for us. Could it theoretically be that creation was 6 days in God's time?
Sure. Yeah, I don't want to get too bogged down in this. I appreciate and I've heard that, let's say, argument before. To me, that's trying to intermix a little too much, trying to make something scientific out of the divine. I would rather just say mystery. Maybe it's that, maybe it's not. I'd rather just leave it in mystery, though. So I think that can be used as a good argument, but again, I try not to intermix them at all. I'd rather just live in the tension of, yep, it's both. You know what I mean? Instead of, that's a little bit of a, let's say, a word game. Oh, this equals this. And then the only problem is that if you ever find something else where it says this does not equal this, then you're in trouble. So I'd rather just live in the mystery a little bit. Yeah.
I just want to say it seems ridiculous to expect that every person involved in the church has some external historian writing everything down.
Uh-huh.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, how many historians were there out there writing everything down? I think that's absurd.
Mm-hmm.
It's an impossible standard, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so we trust and believe in the church. And it's good to be here in the boat of salvation. Okay, let me say a few more things because I don't want to go over too much. It happens, sorry. So I mentioned, some of these other types. We'll get into this. I mentioned this week, or in the next 2 weeks, we're going to be reading the first hagiography, which was, again, written by St. Athanasius of Alexandria about St. Anthony. A hagiography is, I always want to say it the Greek way, hagiography, but it sounds kind of weird. It's a specific type of writing that's a much more long form. So this one's about 70 pages. Okay, and this is going to be much different than other Lives of the Saints that we're going to be reading that are much shorter, looking at something that's, just a few pages or just a couple of paragraphs long. And then many of the Lives of the Saints are found in a couple of books that are called the Synaxarion and the Manean. First of all, there are innumerable number of these books. This is one example. Okay, this is a series that came out of actually a monastery here in Buena Vista, and I believe, so this one came out of a monastery in Buena Vista, and this is one of a series of saints, Lives of Saints, that was compiled from a much, much larger set. And so you often find a lot of texts that look like this, just compilation of the Lives of the Saints, usually thematically or time period. I actually have a set that somebody bought me that's bigger than an encyclopedia set. It's huge. It's these big green books, and there's one for every month of the year. It's one of these things like if you read a life of the saint from it every day of the year, just one, you would have to read through it for like 30 years because each day has like 30 lives of the saints. So it's a tremendous book.
What's it doing to condense everything down? Like the prologue of Orid, I have that.
Yeah, so that's a condensed book. Yeah, so there are all of these different series that have been compiled over the years, which means there's no canon of the Lives of the Saints. So in this way, I mentioned this a little bit before, that there's an aspect of the Lives of the Saints that are somewhat like fairy tales, right? And fairy tales are a very, very important part of culture. And, especially if you grew up in American culture, you probably were raised on certain fairy tales, right? Cinderella, Lion King, Snow White. So all these different fairy tales, and they become, a basis and establishment very much for culture. The Lives of the Saints are very much the same, except they're not fairy tales. We see them as real life, but they become the establishment of the church, right? The church is grounded in the Lives of the Saints. If we throw out the Lives of the Saints, we've thrown out, let's say, the culture of the church as a whole. Okay, you're almost just left with this empty husk. Because they really are the bedrock of the church. And so these different sources, for the Lives of the Saints are vast. Each church will have their own. There'll be a Greek compilation. The prologue of Ohrid is from a Macedonian, which is a great compilation. The compilations are nice because someone has gone through and kind of picked out the great highlights. And so we're going to be going through and looking at these stories, fantastic stories and again, some mundane stories. And I hope that, as we go through these readings that you'll, be emboldened, right? To increase your devotion to God, not emulation necessarily of the saints. And that we create a fervor, let's say, for the saints. because it's a very, very important aspect of the church. And like I said, I was just thinking about this over the last few days as I was putting this together, like, it'd be so great if we just once a month started reading a life together. But yeah. Any questions?
I just have a comment. You just said that if you take out the lives of the saints, you're left with this husk, and I feel like that's what the Protestant church did, and so now they only have the current culture, and I say this as a person who spent most of my life there. So when a man of God has a fall, it devastates the whole culture for a while. It basically just makes everybody feel invalidated. And
Right.
the world can point and say, see, you're not real, you're all hypocrites because it's some person had fun. Because we didn't have the bedrock of the saints that really were saints
Right.
and had died, and we recognize them as being holy. And if you're just in the current culture, you don't have that.
Right. Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point, and thought about that.